Relationships can be absolutely life-giving and at the same time incredibly messy. Or let me say it a different way, relationships can be absolutely life-giving and at times incredibly life-draining. And those relationships take different forms, right? We experience that in the relationships with the people we live with, where people we go to school with, or people we work with. We know that relationships can be really good, or relationships can be really not good. Relationships can be really easy, or relationships can be really difficult. And we also know that every one of us can be that life-giving influence in someone's life, and every one of us, if left to ourselves, can be that draining influence in someone else's life. And so all the applications in this series, Relationship Rehab, actually stem from things going on, not just in our relationships, but actually things going on in our relationships that stem from things going on in our hearts. And so the series artwork has been designed in such a way that it reminds us that it all goes back to our heart and the condition of our heart. And really, for those of us whose hope is in Jesus, we will apply this truth best when we apply this truth in light of the good news of the gospel and allow God to actually transform those parts of our lives through the wisdom we're going to talk about in the passage. And I think that the wisdom we're going to talk about in the passage can actually transform every kind of relationship that's represented in this room, part of a group of books of the Bible that are sometimes referred to as wisdom literature. And the book of Proverbs is a little different than the rest of the wisdom literature. I want to unpack that because if we look at Proverbs and we try to apply the book of Proverbs like we do all the other books of the Bible, it actually presents some issues for us, and I want to talk about what they are. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about what is a proverb and what makes a proverb a proverb. A proverb with a lowercase p is a short statement that encapsulates wisdom. It's a few short words that actually communicate something that would otherwise take a long time to communicate. Some of you wish I would preach in the form of a proverb, right? See what I did there with that? At any rate, there are lots of proverbs with the lowercase p that we are familiar with just in living life. Sort of they're part of our cultural fabric and our way of speaking. For example, you can finish these proverbs with me. The early bird catches the worm. Don't cry over. I feel like there are three of us in this room. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but which is not true, right? Or this one, a dog is man's best friend. And those of you who know that I always complain about our family dog, Walt, I mean, I just want to prove that I am willing to be his friend if he will, I feel like I was more of his friend than he was my friend on Thursday night when Michelle snapped the picture. But, for you animal lovers who sometimes grow weary in hearing me complain about my dog, we do have a love-hate relationship, and in this case, it was more of a love relationship on Thursday. But you are familiar with Proverbs because we kind of throw them out. What's different from the lowercase Proverbs that sets them up, that is different than the uppercase Proverbs or the book of Proverbs in the Bible, is that the book of Proverbs is filled with God's wisdom that is highly practical and actually speaks God's truth and applies that truth to our lives. And what the book of Proverbs does is it describes how a relationship with God plays into the daily lives of followers of Jesus. Now, Proverbs are guidelines for living, not necessarily guarantees for life. A proverb is not necessarily a promise as much as it is an axiom or a truism. And let me give you an example of that. So if I were to throw out a common proverb of the day that says, look both ways before you cross the street and you won't get hit by a car, there could be the time where you look both ways and cross the street and you do get hit by a car, right? No, you're thinking that's impossible? I don't want you to try it, but I would say that is more of a truism than it is a promise. But let's take a proverb from the book of Proverbs and just use that as an example. If you would read Proverbs chapter 3, verse 2, it says there, if you obey the commandments of the Lord, then you will have long days in this life. It's a good guideline for living. But the reality is, when you look at Jesus' disciples, all 12 of them, or at least 11 of them, or you look at modern-day martyrs like Dietrich Bonhoeffer or Jim Elliot, who were absolutely faithful to the commands of Jesus, yet gave their lives to him at a young age, It's really hard. It's a hard pill to swallow if you're looking at Proverbs chapter 3, verse 2 as a guarantee or a promise. If you obey the commandments of the Lord, then you will have long days in this life. If I were Dietrich Bonhoeffer or Jim Elliot, I would challenge that one, and maybe you would as well. So it's not like if I obey the Lord, I'm going to live life well past my 30s. That is a guideline. And so it is with Proverbs 10:27. The years of the wicked will be short. There are at times, even as you look at the history of the world, where that is not true in every single case. It is more of an axiom or a guideline. Now, that does not mean that Proverbs are not true, that the Proverbs are not a part of the authoritative voice of God as he communicates it through God's word. Again, just Proverbs are not necessarily promises. They are principles for living. And so enough said about that. Let me say this too. Proverbs are so jam-packed with truth that they are meant to be thought about, prayed through, mulled over, meditated on, so that they can be applied to life. And there are various proverbs and various themes in the book of Proverbs that deal with all kinds of issues, but there are a great many proverbs that actually speak to relationships, that can actually transform our relationships if we'll apply them to our relationships. And so today, we're going to talk a lot about life-giving relationships and what it is that makes a life-giving relationship a life-giving relationship. And to do that, we're going to focus most of our time in Proverbs chapter 27. And then from here, over the next 4 or 5 weeks, we're going to deal with some of those things that exist in our own hearts that actually prevent us from having life-giving relationships, whether it's bitterness, whether it's anger, whether it's pride, whether it's envy. I know none of us would deal with issues like that, but for other people, that was a joke. Tough crowd today. I mean, really, right, we deal with pride and envy and anger and bitterness, and so it would do us well to actually hear this wisdom and apply it to our lives, because by and large, those tough relationships that we have with other people, the issues we have, the friction we experience in relationships, as much as we would like to think it's the other person, right, a lot of times the issues in our relationships exist where? In us. In our own hearts. And so that's going to be the focus. And so to bring us to a place where we can start to unpack some of that, we're going to focus on Proverbs 27 and just 5 different verses and 4 truths that emerge from those 5 different verses. And when we put them together, there's sort of like an overarching truth that is woven throughout all of them together, and that's we is better than me. And that is something that's communicated throughout the scriptures, that from the Garden of Eden, as God said, it's not good for man to be alone, to God calling out from among himself in the Old Testament a people who would be his people, who would identify with him as the one true God, to the New Testament, where Jesus pours his life into 12 guys, to the early church that took the world by storm. God's design is for us to experience deep and meaningful relationships with him and with each other. We need life-giving relationships, but there are, as I said, things going on inside of all of us that actually pull us away from those life-giving relationships. And so one of the truths that brings us back to life-giving relationships is a truth that's communicated in Proverbs chapter 27, verses 5 and 6, that is better for an open rebuke than hidden love, that wounds from a friend can be trusted, but an enemy actually multiplies kisses. Which I think is a complex proverb because there is so much buried in here. But if we look at it and when we start to try to make sense of it, it seems to me that it's saying better to rebuke your friend than not loving them enough to rebuke them. Or as we apply it in a different way, as the recipient of the rebuke, a friend that lovingly confronts us is actually worth their weight in gold. And the reason why I love this is it actually pushes us toward these life-giving relationships, because it seems to me that a friendship or a relationship that always kind of tells us what we want to hear, as much as we think that those multiplied kisses are good for us, those multiplied kisses that aren't honest with us actually end up hurting us in the first place. And that which hurts us when that person is honest with us and tells us something about ourselves that we may not want to hear, that actually is the thing that God can use to bring healing and wholeness and turns out to be a good thing. So better is that open rebuke than that hidden kind of love. What it shows us is this truth that starts to emerge, that life-giving relationships are actually built on speaking the truth to one another in a loving way. It brings to mind words in the New Testament where we're called to speak the truth in love to one another. But sometimes we take this to two different extremes, and to illustrate this, I'd like to use sort of an object lesson. The first extreme that we can take it to is in our relationships, when we seek relationships that only sort of multiply those kisses, those relationships where it's all love and there's never any kind of rebuke, never any kind of challenge, never any kind of friction, where we depend on people to sort of kind of bobblehead their way through their relationship with us. I had to borrow this bobblehead from Pastor Paul. It came from his office, Mary Kate. It's Mr. Met, and I'm wondering, is there a Mets fan here today? Just Mary Kate, but mostly by default because you're married to Paul, right? Yeah, but there was only one in every service today, I will say that. Now, there probably are a couple Phillies fans, no? Yes. Philly fans in general, no matter the sport, are generally obnoxious, but Rich, you grimaced, I noticed. It is true, and noticed you weren't very obnoxious when you identified yourselves today, so thank you for that. But Mr. Met here, he does illustrate the danger of the pendulum swinging too far to love without any kind of truth or any kind of honesty about that the other person. And so we can take that relationship to that other extreme and just look for that bobblehead, that kind of yes person, yes, that you can see how that those multiplied kisses would wound that friendship. But we can take it the other way in our relationships too, and we can focus on the rebuke and, that open rebuke is a good thing, right? And God has put me in this relationship to kind of tell you how you are and tell it the way it is. And we'll allow that pendulum to shift too far from truth, not toward love. And what happens is we start to become the fly swatter in our relationships, Rich, and we just start hitting the people around us, and it's just rebuke, because we think it's God's job, or we think it's our job from God to rebuke the people that God has placed in our lives. Isn't that fun? You feel attacked. You probably should. I'm going to keep this up here just in case I need it. You've experienced that perhaps in certain relationships with the fly swatter. Both are dangerous. Again, the words of Proverbs 27, 5 and 6, I think are so important for us. We don't want to be bobbleheads in our relationships, but we also shouldn't seek out bobbleheads in our relationships. We need those people who are willing to wound us for the purpose of bringing healing to us on the other side. Those relationships are relationships that we invite those people in, and that takes time. We also, in our relationships, don't self-appoint as the fly swatter who, just say, well, better open rebuke than hidden love. Swat. We need to apply the whole of that wisdom. And so that brings us to the truth that life-giving relationships, they're built on that very bedrock of speaking the truth in a loving way. All truth without love, that's a dangerous thing. All love without any truth, that's also dangerous. So do you gravitate more toward the bobblehead or the fly swatter? And do you have people in your life who actually do lovingly tell you what you need to hear and at times not what you want to hear? And then are you pouring into those relationships where you can be and do the same? Are you part of a community of people who is able to do that for you? And again, it's both and. It's love and truth are important, and they're best lived out together. Notice how in each of these proverbs too, there is a me application and an us application. And you've heard that in this one. Now, let me take us to the next one that helps to rehab our relationships. That's verse 9. And just to review what we heard there, perfume and incense bring joy to the heart, and the pleasantness of a friend springs from their heartfelt advice. So let me give you a little background on this proverb. In that day when it was written, if you would have someone over to your house, if you were a good host, you would apply to that person's head when they left your home some sort of perfume or ointment, and you would send them away with sort of like this good smelling aroma. And it's kind of a strange concept. I hadn't thought about it. Maybe I should bring some Axe spray or something and spray y'all as you leave church. I don't know. But anyway. No, Melanie's like, no, please don't do that. And I won't do that, actually, I promise. But at any rate, it's sort of a strange practice, but the idea here was that the relationship would leave with you, that relationship, that interaction you had with that person would leave you with that sweet smell that would carry you through. I talked about last week in my Easter message how smells can take us places, scents can take us places. I talked about how my grandmother wore Windsong perfume, and then I had people of a certain demographic, age-wise, sing to me the jingle for Windsong perfume that was, I guess, on TV, or maybe, judge it from the demographic, maybe radio, back in the day. It was kind of funny, but for me, like that scent, it takes me to a place. And I had a bunch of people throughout the week that talk about these different scents for you and the places they take you. But the scent of our relationship, as people think of us, that should do something in their hearts. And we have scents in our lives that actually give us warm fuzzies, and then we have scents that just make us just feel really kind of not that good, right? Like, I don't want to share any scents that make me feel bad, but we also have these relationships that leave us feeling really good, or relationships that actually leave us feeling really bad. But the relationships that should leave that good scent on us are actually those relationships through which we're able to receive a heartfelt advice. And to kind of go a little deeper than that word heartfelt advice, this would be advice that comes from the heart. This would be wisdom that actually comes from God. It's not like that surface level type of wisdom that's being referenced. It's actually a wisdom that goes much deeper, a wisdom that actually changes our hearts and then gets imparted to the people around us. And so I think that this proverb is best understood as pointing us to these life-giving relationships that actually give us godly wisdom when we need it the most. And the reality is all of us need wisdom because we don't have enough wisdom to be able to live life to its fullest. We don't have enough wisdom to be able to live a life that glorifies God in every direction. And a lot of us, we carry with us the collective wisdom we pick up from the people around us, whether it's the wisdom we grew up with our parents, or the wisdom that comes from our friends, or from the things we read or the things we watch. And some of that wisdom is very helpful, and some of that wisdom, if not sifted through God's word, it actually can hurt us because it's not based on God's truth. So it's not just that we need any wisdom, we need God's wisdom. And the reality is we become like the people we allow to influence us. And so the question for all of us is who is influencing us? Who are we getting our wisdom from? And actually, I guess, do we want to become the people that we are getting that wisdom from? We need to put ourselves in those environments, in those kind of relationships where we can receive that godly kind of wisdom. So the question for us is, who are the people who are speaking into your life? Who are the people who are pouring into your life as they kind of leave their aroma on you? What kind of aroma, what kind of smell is it? And I thought about illustrating this through emojis, and I had a harder time finding like the sweet smelling emoji than the bad smelling one, because everyone knows if I was going to tell it through emojis. The poop emoji. Yeah, Mary Kate, thank you. Mary Kate mouthed the word poop to me, and that was helpful. But we can leave an aroma on people, right? Right? And sometimes the aroma we leave is good, and sometimes the aroma we leave smells like poop. And so that causes us to take a look inside ourselves and the kind of people we're seeking to influence us. That causes us to take a good look outside of ourselves as well, and how we're influencing the people outside of us. And so are you the type of person who gives godly counsel? Is the wisdom you are imparting based on the wisdom God gives, or the wisdom that's just your garden variety, kind of like everyday wisdom? And then do you have a relationship where you're able to seek that godly wisdom from other people? And then what kind of aroma is that leaving on you and on me, and are we leaving on others? Again, so moving on then from that, we move into verse 10, which is an odd one on the surface, and so we'll unpack it. But do not forsake your friend or the friend of your family, and do not go to your relative's house when disaster strikes you. Better a neighbor nearby than a relative far away. To put ourselves in the place of this particular proverb when it was written, in those days, you would depend on your family for everything. Families banded together out of sheer necessity. And in your family, you would find your vocation. So if your father was a butcher or baker or a candlestick maker, you would become a butcher, a baker, or a candlestick maker yourself. But also in your family, you would find your identity. You would discover kind of who you were, and you would like kind of see the world through the lenses of your family. It was a very like family-focused culture. And I can imagine for people who would read this particular proverb, it might be challenging to them because they would band together at all cost. And perhaps when disaster would strike, they might feel the need to go and be with their family far off, when maybe the wiser thing to do would be to seek those people who had become family, who are more nearby. I like this proverb too because it talks about when disaster strikes, not if disaster strikes. In other words, for all of us, it's not if we're going to deal with hard things, it's when we're going to deal with hard things. We become disillusioned with life and disillusioned with God when we think that it's an if rather than a when. And so we need to expect challenging circumstances. But the other thing this pushes us toward is to have those kind of relationships with people that we do have a place to go when life is difficult, and to invest in relationships in such a way where those people have a place to go when their lives are difficult. There's a beauty that comes. But notice that the call here is not to forsake our friends or the friends of our family. And I'm wondering why we're warned not to forsake them if we don't have some things going on within us that cause us to forsake those closest relationships. It makes a lot of sense then that there are all kinds of things that go on inside of us that would make us want to forsake friendships. And we're going to deal with those things in this series. We're going to deal with, that unchecked bitterness or that unresolved conflict. We're going to deal with issues like anger and what do we do when the people around us get under our skin and get in our nerves. Or we're going to deal with pride. What happens when we view ourselves more highly than we should. We're going to deal with contentment and deal with like that envy. Oh, I wish that my relationship looked more like this relationship, or I wish this person in my life looked more this way, or I wish I had this. We're going to deal with all those things, and all those things are those things that cause us to forsake those relationships that we are to regard highly. But it is true that old saying, familiarity breeds contempt. I mean, that is true. That the more familiar we become with people, the closer we live with people, the more real we become with people, the easier they're able to see our insufficiencies and our flaws. How many of you have people in your lives who are flawed in some way? And how many of you are the flawed person in someone else's life, right? So we all kind of have experienced this both ways. And so it's true, familiarity does breed contempt. I told a story in every service, and so I guess I'll do it in this service too, even though this is the service that gets recorded and kind of like put out there for the world to see. I guess whatever part of the world is like clicking on the Grace Church website and looking up our sermons. But for those of you who ever had to live with someone you didn't choose to live with, that's a really difficult place to be. You might have encountered that in college. You might have encountered that in the military. You might have encountered that in an altogether different context. But those kind of close quarter living situations bring out the worst in people. And that happened to me my freshman year of college. And so I was like this wide-eyed freshman. And when I went to college, we found out who our roommates were. Like, you fill out a survey, and for you, like people who are affiliated with residence life at school, okay, I'm not knocking like what you all do to match people up, but at my school, I felt like they failed miserably because we had to fill out these surveys and then like send them back through the mail, and then they would match us up to like a good roommate who was similar to you. I'm not sure what happened in the process of matching me and my freshman roommate together, but something went wrong, terribly, terribly wrong. In the process, it did not go very well at all. In fact, when I got to, we fill out the survey, you send it back, and then we got the name of our roommate in the mail, which I guess dates me a little bit. Like some of you probably got that information through email or something like that. We got it through the mail, and then we did email back and forth, me and my freshman roommate, and I think we talked once on the phone, and I thought this is going to be fine. And we got to school. Now keep in mind, okay, I went to a Christian college, and I felt like in my ignorance that every Christian is going to be easy to live with because we all love Jesus. And it is going to be like rainbows and butterflies. And this is going to be my forever friend. And this is so cool, so cool. And so I got there and things got off to a pretty good start with my roommate until I discovered that he was a hermit. Like, he rarely left the room for much of anything. He'd go to class and he'd be right back there in the room. And, he would go and get his meals from the dining hall, but he would get them at takeout. And then he'd bring them back to the room. Like, he was always there. Now, I grew up in a house that had 8 people living in it, and we only had, one bathroom. And I was used to having people around me a lot, but I was not used to having people around me all the time, like all the live long day, like just like morning, noon, and night. This guy was in the room, but it got even worse because he had this habit of eating his meals in the room, and he wouldn't finish his meal. He would kind of like put it back in the container, and guess where the container went when he was done? Do you think it went in the trash? Oh no, he left it there. Do you know what happens to containers of food when they're just left there for days and sometimes weeks on end? Do you know what happens? Do you know the kind of smells? Talking about smells, you know what kind of smells can come from mediocre food left in takeout containers? Do you know what kind of insects they can draw? I do, from my own experience. And so that idea of familiarity breeding contempt characterizes my living situation my freshman year of college. I had so much contempt for my roommate. And maybe for you, God has placed someone in your life. You have this relationship with someone you live with, someone you work with, someone you go to school with. And because of your close living situation or just your close proximity where life has brought you, there's so much familiarity and a whole lot of contempt for that person. And it's caused you to forsake them in some way. That those flaws that you've now seen and discovered, they're causing you to take a step away rather than a step toward. And I would say that there's a better way, a wiser way to handle that relationship, and that comes through in this passage. I'll also say this, that there's a lot of work that God wants to do, I think, in our lives, kind of leading up to those relationships that we experience. And one of the places where you also sometimes learn that there is a different way to do things is in your marriage relationship, whenever that happens. And now Michelle's not in the rooms. Oh, she is in the room, darn it. You just appeared there like a ghost. You're just like, well, there goes that. So I want to hold it open up right now. I just, like somebody, Rich, take over. Sometimes in your marriage, you discover there is a different way to do things. And I discovered, like our first week of marriage, that Michelle had a completely different way of doing the dishes than Grammy did growing up at home, because I had this grandmother who raised me, and so everything is, well, Grammy did it this way, or Grammy did it that way, or Grammy cooked it this way, or Grammy cooked it that way. And it's almost become like a joke in our house, oh, Grammy said, or Grammy did. And so I had this weird idea, or, the way we shopped for groceries. I remember the first time we got home from our honeymoon, Michelle went grocery shopping, and it was like completely different. And it totally rocked my world. And now on the other side of it, clearly Michelle was right and I was wrong all along the way, right? But it's like that little stuff. Or maybe for you, in your context, like you discovered in having to live with people, like they put the toilet paper in the toilet paper holder the wrong way. Because clearly the right way, ordained by God, was that the toilet paper goes under the roll, right? Right? Some of you are shaking your head. Some of you are so upset right now. You want to just squash me like a bug. You want to swat me. Right? No, relationships are hard. And sometimes it's so easy to forsake those relationships, even our closest relationships. And so if left to ourselves in that familiarity that breeds contempt, there can be a whole lot of contempt in your marriage, or there can be a whole lot of contempt toward your parents, or a whole lot of contempt toward your kids, or there can be a whole lot of contempt toward your boss, or a whole lot of contempt toward your employees, or a whole lot of contempt toward your coworkers, or there can be a whole lot of contempt toward your boyfriend or your girlfriend, or there can be a whole lot of contempt toward this friend who has failed you in some way, or even in your church relationships, relationships, there can be a whole lot of contempt toward your pastor, or there can be a whole lot of contempt toward your particular church family, or for a pastor, there can be a whole lot of contempt toward your congregants, or there can be a whole lot of contempt toward the church family. That contempt is so common in our relationships, and it's easy for us to forsake friendships. It's easy for us to forsake relationships. It's easy for us when hard times come to go in the opposite direction rather than lean into those relationships. And this particular proverb points us to life-giving relationships, because the more we're able to see those people that God has placed in our lives through the lenses of Jesus, the better we're able to view people through the lenses of the gospel, the more we'll be able to love them the way Jesus does, and the more and the better we'll be able to believe the best about them. Because there will be times in our relationships when we will be tempted to forsake the relationship. But as we learn to believe the best about each other, as we learn to be there for one another when disaster strikes, as we learn what it means to be that friend that sticks closer than a brother, we're there for each other in good times and in bad times. And sometimes it's your bad time that I need to be there for you in. And sometimes it's my bad time that you need to be there for me in. But the point of this particular proverb is that life-giving relationships are a blessing when we face life's challenges, that we need those life-giving relationships with the people that God has placed us in close proximity with. And though we may be tempted to forsake them, we need to lean into them. And while we may think in our 21st century American minds that individualism is a sign of strength, it's actually in a lot of ways, not every way, but it's actually in a lot of ways a sign of weakness, because we can't become everything God wants us to be and everything Jesus died and lives to make us if we're living in isolation. Our faith in Jesus is personal. It's not at all private. We were created for community, to know and to be known. And so who are those people that are investing in you? Who are those people that you are investing in? And have you chose to invest and not to isolate, or have you chose to isolate and not invest? See, relationships are challenging, relationships are work, but the life-giving ones, we lean into them when there are tough times. And then there's this last proverb that might be more familiar than the others. It's verse 17. As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. Now, you probably know this, that I don't have a lot of iron instruments laying around my home. But I do know that iron, if it's used a lot, it starts to get dull and it needs to be sharpened. And in order for that to happen, that iron needs to come in contact with that other iron. And through that sharpening process, through that bringing together that involves heat, friction, and close contact, there is a sharpening that takes place. That you can't sharpen an axe or a knife from a distance. You need to come close enough to make the sparks fly. And so it is in our relationships. Sometimes in our relationships, the sparks do fly. In our relationships, there is conflict over one thing or another. And I got to tell you, as embarrassing as it is for me, I lived like the vast majority of my life living in such a way where I feared conflict and shied away from conflict at any and every cost. Like, get me away from it. It must be a bad thing. Let me just kind of like hunker down over here, and I'll just pretend like nothing bad's happening inside me or outside me, and we'll just kind of all be okay. But that's not at all God's design. Like, God uses conflict in relationships to actually do something on the other side. He actually uses that conflict to actually help us to become stronger on the other side of it as we choose to lean into it, and as we choose to, again, as we talked about, believe the best about one another and work through that conflict together. And that does involve like a bringing together. And so as you bring that iron together, the sparks do fly. But as you do so, as they're close enough for God to do his work, as they're close enough for authenticity and accountability and vulnerability, there's a work there that only God can do. And so that points us to this truth that life-giving relationships actually make us better versions of ourselves. And I don't want to sound new agey when I say that. And I don't want to sound loosey-goosey when I say that. What I mean is the best version of yourself is the you that Jesus wants to transform you into. The best version of me is the me that Jesus wants to transform me into. And when we're vulnerable and accountable and when we're authentic, we start to look more and more like Jesus, because those relationships, we start to rub off on one another and we become sharper on the other side of it. I read somewhere recently that every one of us needs in our lives an Apostle Paul, a Barnabas, and a Timothy. And if that sounds foreign to you, let me just unpack it for all of us. That every one of us needs an Apostle Paul. In the New Testament, God called the Apostle Paul to do this great work for the kingdom, right? He led the early church to take the world by storm. In fact, the world has never been the same, largely because God had called that man named Saul to put his hope in Jesus. And God used him in just a phenomenal kind of a way. But Paul was further along the road. He was a champion of the Christian faith that people could look up to and whose faith could be mirrored. Yesterday at Betty Shane's funeral, I was talking about how I was thinking about her life, and now Philippians chapter 4, I thought encapsulated her life. And Paul says in that passage that whatever you have heard or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. The Apostle Paul was that guy for a lot of people that they could see his life and then apply the truth of God as lived out through his life. They could apply that to their lives. Every one of us needs an Apostle Paul who is investing in us. Who is that Apostle Paul in your life that's investing in you? Who is that voice that's able to speak into your life? Who's able to challenge you at times and lead you to be that better person or the better version of yourself that Jesus wants to make you? Who can be that sanctifying influence in your life? But we also need a Barnabas. Barnabas literally means son of encouragement. He was one that God had sent with those early church fathers to join them in some of that work. And that Barnabas type is that person who walks with you. It's that shoulder to shoulder kind of a relationship. Someone who will encourage you along the way. Who is that Barnabas that God has placed in your life to cheer you on? And then we all need a Timothy. Timothy was Paul's protege. He was one who Paul had poured his life into. Paul had, for all intents and purposes, replicated himself through his servant Timothy. Who is your Timothy? Who are you investing in? And that's one of the beautiful things about the local church and the beautiful things about the intergenerational relationships we have is that we have one another. If we choose to see it that way and live in that way in relationships, we can have that Apostle Paul and that Barnabas and that Timothy relationship. Again, the point of the Proverbs today is that we is better than me. And it all goes back to the gospel. The danger of the book of Proverbs is we can kind of pick and choose the Proverbs and then we can try to, in our own strength, just live them out. But if we live this truth out apart from the saving work of Jesus in our hearts or the work of the Holy Spirit as he sanctifies us, if we just try to apply the Proverbs without that, we have taken steps into moralism, which is a counterfeit form of faith. That all of this begins and ends with Jesus. All of this begins and ends with the gospel. All of this is fueled by the good news of the gospel and everything that God is, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He is the one who brings out of us what he put in us. And if we're going to live out this truth, it begins with us fixing our eyes on Jesus, putting our hope in Jesus. And as followers of Jesus, it continues as we draw our strength, as we draw our wisdom from the one who is wisdom, who is Jesus himself. And so as you think about these Proverbs in those terms, what is the way where do you need to most apply this to your life? Or in what way does this need to be applied to your life? Maybe for you, it's to ask that trusted friend what it's like to be on the other side of you. Or maybe it's to spend more time in God's word so that you can have more of God's wisdom. Or maybe it's to bless someone who is going through a difficult time, to be that sort of Barnabas encouraging type of person in that other person's journey. Maybe for you it's to invest in a relationship that's kind of difficult, or maybe to lean into that relationship in the midst of conflict, even though the sparks are flying. What do you sense God saying, and then how will you and I use it to influence us? And what I want to do is I want to meld together where we've just been in the book of Proverbs with what we've gathered to celebrate this morning, and that is the Lord's Supper. And what I want to do is I want to remind us that the Lord's Supper is this practice that was initiated by Jesus himself that reminds us of the gospel that's at work. Reminds us of Jesus' finished work on the cross. It reminds us of the effect that it's had in our lives as men and women who've been transformed by the good news of Jesus. The bread and the cup, as we take it, we celebrate that good news of Jesus. It reminds us that God has always wanted to have a relationship with us through his Son. It reminds us that it's God who pursued us first. We love God because he first loved us. It reminds us that as we put our faith in Jesus, we are a new creation. The old is gone, the new has come. It reminds us that God actually wants to sanctify us as we continue to live our lives for Jesus. Because Jesus has overcome sin and overcame death. We can overcome sin and overcome death by Christ in us. As the Apostle Paul said, Christ in you, that is our hope of glory. But we also realize that the Lord's Supper, it's not just centered on our relationship with God. It's centered on our relationships with the people around us. It's centered on our relationships with the people that God has placed in our lives, the easy ones and the difficult ones. And what the Lord's Supper does is it moves us to not just think about Jesus, but to think about our own hearts, how they live in relationship with God and how they live in relationship with other people. And what I want to do as we prepare for the Lord's Supper, as the worship team comes and prepares to lead us, is I want us to have a time of silent prayer. And I want us to take a look inside our hearts and to begin to ask God to reveal to us any known sin, and to take the opportunity to confess any kind of area of our hearts that need to be dealt with, so that we can approach God, so that we can approach the Lord's Supper with clean hearts. And so what I'd like to do is to allow you to have the time to remember what Jesus accomplished for you on the cross, a time to reflect on your relationship with God and with other people, and then to repent of your sin and to allow the Spirit of God to do a transforming work before we come together. And then after our time of silent prayer, I'd like to lead us in a corporate prayer, after which we'll pray together the Lord's Prayer using the words sins and sin. So let's spend the time with God right now.